name is Stephen Herzog. I am a senior researcher in nuclear arms control at ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, where I work at the Center for Security Studies. I'm also an associate of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I am the co-chair of the Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group. So I work on a range of different issues thematically, pretty much all of which are related to the global nuclear order in some ways. So, for example, I've written a couple pieces looking at how the nuclear dynamics of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine will affect the global nuclear order, will affect desires related to proliferation, arms control, how it will affect the future of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I also do some other work because I have a background as working on verification for the US government of nuclear treaties, where I look at what are the future dimensions and dynamics of nuclear verification, how will emerging and disruptive technologies affect the ability to verify arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And generally speaking, I would say I come out these issues with a pretty broad and sometimes heterodox view. While I work internally in established academic structures and systems, I very much enjoy finding ways to challenge existing orthodoxies and hierarchies internally and get systems to adapt and change and recognize their flaws. Thanks very much for the question. I do appreciate that. So I was born on a naval nuclear subbase in Groton, Connecticut, and had a family, a father who was associated with the U.S. nuclear program growing up. And I didn't really think all that much about these issues, although I would say I grew up with an inordinate amount of coffee table books and spy novels and diagrams of submarines and books about nuclear weapons. But that was just kind of part of the backdrop of my childhood. And I think, as with many children who grow up in military type families, I was a little bit rebellious as a child. I wasn't really interested in these types of things. I was more interested in playing music, dyeing my hair different colors, having at one point a dozen facial piercings and whatnot, playing in a band, all of these things. And when I went to college, I was sitting in my first ever international relations class that I probably slept through part of it. I had pink hair. I had, again, facial piercings everywhere. And the unit on nuclear weapons came up, which I hadn't done too much thinking about. And the professor pulled me aside after class and essentially said, "What's going on?" And the point that the professor made was, you've been an okay student, pretty good so far. But when it came to this topic of nuclear weapons, you really seem to have some knowledge of it, and you can pursue this and do it professionally. So that is what I have been doing from that moment forward, generally speaking. And so after I got my undergraduate degree, I did a master's in security studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown while I was working at the Federation of American Scientists, the organization that deals with the intersection of science and international security, founded by a former Manhattan Project scientist who changed their mind about the bomb. I then got picked up by the U.S. Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration and worked for several years doing verification issues related to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. I spent quite a lot of time working in the Middle East and also in Central Asia and the Caucasus, essentially building partner capacity in geophysical monitoring to support treaties, and also a little bit in Southeast Asia too. And at a certain point, while it was really interesting and I felt like I was making a difference, it began to feel a little bit taxing with all of the traveling and doing things again over and over again. And I really kind of started to find a bunch of questions in my head that I hadn't thought about in a long time. Theoretical questions, questions from the literature. And I decided to go back to school, get a PhD, which I did at Yale University, at which point I wound up at Harvard, Project on Managing the Atom, and now here in Zurich, here in my apartment, talking about this. And when I think back historically to my trajectory and what I do, I think it's about a lot of different pieces. So when I was younger and was really out there, I didn't like nuclear weapons. Like, I was interested in the idea of protesting and radicalism and smashing the bomb and destroying the patriarchy, inspiring for radical change like that. And I think that these are things that I still aspire to in many different ways, but I don't do them so much via protest. And when I got to be a think tanker, I was writing articles for newspapers and online publications about like why the United States should ratify the CTBT, why additional things should happen related to the additional protocol, nuclear safeguards. So policy issues on a day-to-day basis. And then when I was working in government, it was like, these tiny nuts and bolts of operational details of verification. And now, as an academic, I work on broader issues related to the global nuclear order, multilateral nuclear arms control, how to get states to think about moving beyond nuclear deterrence. And I have the benefit to sit back, have time, really think about things, not being on a compressed timeline. And one of the things that I think is oftentimes in the field, whether you're talking to an activist or a government official or a scholar or a think tanker, people sometimes don't like the things that others do to some extent. They think like their way is the right way to do it. And, I've gone through the chain and done these things. And I'd like to believe, at least as far as those of us who are aspiring for eventual nuclear disarmament, we may have different approaches and we may have different methods, but I at least hope that we're all on the same team on some level. And so I like to collaborate and interact with people who do, diverse interactive things and things that are generally different than me and that challenge my own thinking on issues because it forces me to continuously be creative and evolve and not be stuck in my shell. There are a few ways of putting this. One is there's great collaboration in academia because not only do we have the Harvard MacArthur Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group, where we've got people from over 20 countries working on issues of disarmament and coming together, but I also have a lot of collaborators who are not part of that group. And so one thing that often doesn't happen in political science is collaboration. It's a very individualistic. The incentive structure for getting a solo authored article on the tenure track, solo authored things are for good reason seen as being much more important than jointly authored or co-authored things. But let's think about science in other fields, medical physics, astrophysics, biology. You always see like 8, 10, 12 co-authors. And I don't do that necessarily. But I think one of the things that I got from working in government is I have certain strengths and weaknesses methodologically, substantively. And I think it's really important to continuously work on a team. So while I do solo stuff and I am incentivized as far as my progression in the field to do so, I oftentimes like working on a team and collaborating on a team. But there is something else you pointed out. And I think there are sharp divides in this field. And we know there are divides in the field. There are certain journals that rarely publish things related to nuclear disarmament and moving beyond deterrence. They're thinking about how to strengthen deterrence posture, thinking about improving nuclear strategy. And so it's really interesting that I feel like the nuclear field has become extensively siloed over time, where there's a group of very much pro-deterrence camp and there's a pro-disarmament camp. And one of the things that, even though my personal advocacy is for disarmament, is by having previously worked for the US government and having interacted in these communities, I do like to maintain one foot in both worlds simultaneously, which I think, is kind of an odd position to be, because I think that I understand for the time being why some countries feel like they have robust requirements of deterrence. I may not agree with it necessarily, but I understand it and can interact in that world and think about how they intersect. But to get back to what you said, are you saying, I think there are divisions, unfortunately, in the field between people on issues and people as far as methods and whatnot. So there are many people I know who support disarmament, but they may use different methods, whether it's critical theories and post-positivism or whether they're using positivist theories, and sometimes they don't always interact nicely. And then there's also a difference in people's ideas about disarmament. I know some people in the United States who I would say are Clinton era Democrats who believe in the idea of nuclear disarmament, but they think it's a lofty, long-term goal and you need robust deterrence until then. Whereas I have other friends and colleagues who, if they could get rid of nuclear weapons right now, they would do that immediately. And so one of the things that I feel like I unfortunately see is I see people who have similar ideas about the world, but they're on different timelines and using different methods, can sometimes be a little bit more combative than they need to be. So those of us who support nuclear disarmament, I feel like we should be spending a lot of our time battling people who work on nuclear deterrence. But oftentimes, instead, what we see is there's no channel of communication between those who work on deterrence and those who work on disarmament. Instead, people within the deterrence camp are destroying each other about their own position, and people within the disarmament camp are destroying each other about their own position. So it remains siloed. And I think for people, whether you want disarmament tomorrow or whether you think disarmament is a long-term goal or something like that, one of the things is nuclear deterrence is the status quo. There are 9 countries with 12,500 nuclear weapons. So if we continuously, have arguments within our own disarmament camp about what's the best method, what's the best modality, and rip each other apart, while we're busy doing that, the deterrence camp that the status quo is continuing to win as far as academics and policy and otherwise. So again, that's why I like our working group, because we bring together a lot of people from a lot of countries who have different methods and views on research and different views on how to affect change. Many of the journals that are the highest cited and most seen journals are, journals that focus on nuclear deterrence as far as nuclear policy. And so when you try and have a class on these, or when you look at a syllabus for someone's class, generally you have weeks and weeks of nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy. And as far as the idea of like moving beyond nuclear deterrence, this is like 1 or 2 readings in the supplementary point, or maybe one class. And so the balance is really off. And when you do get readings related to moving beyond nuclear deterrence, it's like maybe one article about norms and activists, which are obviously part of the equation, but there's also other theorizing about moving beyond that. So I think what I try and do is I try and find a balance between deterrence and disarmament. I know that some people who teach disarmament don't like teaching deterrence. I personally believe that if you want to advocate successfully for disarmament, you really do need to understand proliferation and deterrence and why countries want nuclear weapons and how they think about using them, so you can think about replacements or ways to abolish the logic. And in addition to that, I'm very interested as well in finding a balance as far as gender, as far as authors on the syllabus, which is really difficult, I must say, because of certain publishing biases. And I'm also interested in assigning work, particularly work from underrepresented groups, whether people in indigenous communities or people from the global South as well, too, and making sure that these perspectives can be well known as well. And it's not just the same group of old white men that we're continuously reading, because there are a lot of broad perspectives out there. We often forget that more than 100 countries in the world have joined nuclear weapons free zones. They've decided we're going to live without nuclear deterrence. And I think those perspectives need to be heard in a classroom too. Now, for students, instructors who may be pro-deterrence or something like that, I don't think it serves anyone's point to not teach those viewpoints about alternative positions in the world and just, speak to your own orthodoxy and priesthood. Just like I think that for people who want to move beyond nuclear deterrence, who eventually want to abolish nuclear weapons, it doesn't help us to only speak to ourselves. I think on some level, we need to understand the arguments that are being put forth by others and think about how our literature and scholarship addresses them. And the other thing I like to do, besides just teaching deterrence, disarmament, history, and things like that, is I like to teach subjects which are as well not generally taught in the academy, particularly at top universities. So I enjoy and think it's very useful to teach classes on race and nuclear weapons. I think it's useful to teach classes on indigenous communities and the harms that the nuclear fuel cycle has caused. I think it's important to teach classes about the legacy of countries' nuclear testing programs and nuclear test explosions in the developing world. So I think all of those things are useful and form a more holistic picture. And at the end of the day, while I have my own views, I want my students to be informed consumers of knowledge. So I think there are students who come out of my classes and agree with me, and there are students who come out of my classes and disagree with me. But if we're going to have informed debate, we can't be siloed within our own communities themselves, externally. And so that's really how I try to approach the subject. I think that one thing that people forget about nuclear weapons is quite simply that you can't opt out of nuclear weapons. And here in Europe, we see a lot of information about this today, given the nuclear dynamics of the war in Ukraine, given the risky behavior that we've seen, even though the reactors are now in cold shutdown at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, that countries, including Switzerland, where I'm working, that are neutral, many people thought we've opted out of these issues. We don't have to deal with nuclear weapons and nuclear politics. It's generally not true, unfortunately. And with 12,500 nuclear weapons around the world and in the hands of nine people, nine countries, I guess nine people if we think about the heads of states of those countries, right? Uh, we're at a situation in the world that people have forgotten about. Back during the Cold War, we had things like a lot of media coverage of nuclear weapons. In the United States, where I'm from, we had duck and cover drills. That time period ended with the end of the Cold War, and we had this period of low salience of nuclear weapons where publics weren't paying attention, but nuclear deterrence continued, large levels of arsenals, right, continued. And now what Putin has done in the war in Ukraine with these constant nuclear threats is, in my view, saying the scary bits and pieces of the puzzle out loud. Putin's nuclear threats, sadly enough, are not new. There have been, over the course of time, well over 100 nuclear threats, probably much more made by leaders. And this is part and parcel of nuclear deterrence. And in our world of 12,500 nuclear weapons, there are hundreds of cities around the world that are 30 minutes away from being destroyed by intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched ballistic missiles. Sometimes, depending on where they are, if they're in Europe, depending on the trajectory, it could be 20 minutes. And we know for a fact that ballistic missile defenses haven't been tested under ideal scenarios and are not really going to protect publics. So whether you live in a nuclear weapon state and someone is being targeted in your name, or whether you live in another country that could be a target of it or could have to deal with the effects for the environment, for populations, for economy and nuclear weapons are an existential risk. And I would put them right in that ballpark with climate change and artificial intelligence. And it's also scary thinking about the ways in which climate change, artificial intelligence, and nuclear weapons may as well interact in the future. So again, we don't get to really opt out of nuclear weapons, so I think it's important for the public to care. And so films like Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, really useful for building up public knowledge of threats and what's out there. But in some ways, I feel like it was a little bit far removed from the contemporary dynamics. The scenarios related to World War II and the Manhattan Project are pretty far away from people's day-to-day lives. So of course, I think there were some missed opportunities to talk about heightened nuclear threats. But again, I think that publics should be part of the discussion, should be part of the debate. And I think that leaders should be attentive to public opinion and think about this. I think there are very few issues that are so encompassing to the survival of humanity, survival of democracy, survival of sovereign states that are at such an elite level, highest classified levels of government in certain countries, that I think we need to think about ways for publics to be involved more in decision making. And I think that publics need to be informed about these types of issues. So I think it's a few things. One is, I think it's the culture of low nuclear salience that I pointed to. And after the Cold War, when Soviet threat dissipated in Western countries, and when the Western threat dissipated in the former Soviet space, and I think there was a lot less focus on these issues. And I think it has been of interest for a long time of nuclear strategists, defense contractors, and others to continue to perpetuate the culture of low nuclear salience. We know from most public opinion polls dating back several decades that publics are not supportive of nuclear weapons, the logic of nuclear deterrence, and are generally pro-disarmament. And I think that leaders, decision makers, and militaries don't want to deal with that. So I think there has been, on some level, a somewhat willful effort to keep these out of the public eye. And I think publics also don't know what to do with this type of information. If I tell someone outside here on the streets in Switzerland that if there were a nuclear attack on a NATO member state next door and the downstream effects of it could affect Switzerland, what would they do? Like, what does the individual person do? And so it's a substantial collective action problem. And I think that as far as nuclear weapons go, like people have a little bit of learned helplessness about this. When things are so scary and so up there at a high level, we tend to not think about them. So one thing that I know from my own work and polling is that when you ask people, do you care about nuclear weapons and nuclear topics? Everyone says yes. They say, I care a lot about them. And then you ask them to rank them as far as their priorities in life, like versus putting food on the table, having a good job, taking care of their family. Nuclear weapons are at the bottom, right, as far as that. And so I think that that is an issue as well. And I think that the climate change movement has been able to get more salience of their positions. There's been more public awareness of these things. They can point to extreme weather events in the world and other things like that, but they've been better at mobilizing people. The nuclear disarmament movement hasn't done a great job at mobilizing people to be on the streets since, for example, the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. So one thing that I find that's really interesting that the TPNW advocates, many of them have done, is they have said, well, if publics aren't interested so much in nuclear issues, we should reach out to pre-existing activist communities. And so, for example, in the United States, the TPNW crowd has reached out to Black Lives Matter, emphasizing the intersection of race and nuclear weapons. They've reached out to people who are climate change advocates and thinking about that. And I think that maybe that is one of the pathways forwards, thinking about the intersectionality of issues. But I mean, I think there's a lot of work to go. And I think that Putin's messaging and nuclear threats related to the war in Ukraine, as awful as they are, as much as I believe that they're just re-emphasizing existing deterrence dynamics that have been around in the world for a long time, I think they're somewhat of an opportunity. They're an opportunity to educate publics that, like, look, this is the world we live in. This is nuclear deterrence, and this is what we've opted into. And here are the assumptions. It's based on rationality. And in many cases in Europe, right, the only thing stopping Russian nuclear weapons, right, from coming to Europe are the fact that the United States, Britain, and France are pointing nuclear weapons at Russian cities, and vice versa. The only thing stopping nuclear weapons from hitting Russian cities, right, are the fact that Russia is threatening these countries. And like, this is the logic. Now, can that logic last forever? I don't know. And I think that nuclear deterrence has been around for a long time and has been predicated upon a lot of different logics. And one of the things that people think is, oh, well, if it's been so stable for so long, it will be fine in the future. The problem with nuclear deterrence is when nuclear deterrence works, it's a non-event. We don't see what actually caused, quote, nuclear deterrence to work. It could be a whole lot of other things. It could be, as Benoit Pelopidas has said, it could be about luck in some sense of the word. And the other thing I would say is, even if nuclear deterrence has been successful in the past, largely or even entirely, that doesn't mean it will be entirely successful in the future. We can't assume that constant trend line. Right now, right, existing models of nuclear deterrence were primarily developed in about a 20-year period after World War II. And they're based on assumptions about nuclear deterrence posture between the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, we have 9 nuclear armed states. Today, we have new emerging and disruptive technologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, which are going to intersect. And I think, can we always expect that every nuclear armed state will think in the same way, or every leader think in the same way of that deterrence logic, which was propagated in books for 20 years? Can we think that all technologies, emerging and disruptive, will apply to that? I don't think so. And I think that that's a little bit scary. I don't see, nuclear deterrence breakdown coming anytime in the near-term future, or use of nuclear weapons, I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. But the trend line is not going to happen forever. And if we were to go back and simulate the Cold War 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and think about all those close calls, the Able Archer incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and whatnot. If we simulated those 10 times, do we escape in every scenario without the use of nuclear weapons and larger societal destruction? Maybe you think we get out of 10 times. How about 100, right? How about 1,000? We simply don't know that. And there is a large component of luck which factors into this. And so, again, just to close the loop on it, I think it's very important. And I think it's one of the reasons we need to be interrogating this. We need the public to be organized and thinking about it, and we need leaders to be open-minded. And there are lots of things in our societies that are always changing, technologies, laws, things like that. Shouldn't our idea about what is providing our security change in the future, particularly when more than 100 countries in the world have decided we don't need this because it's an existential threat to humanity? Issue that concerns me, besides the fact of renewed nuclear salience, although, as I just told you, I think that nuclear salience may be a gift on some level for educating publics about how scary the world we actually live in is. So I, like a lot of other people, am scared about the coming intersection of machine learning and artificial intelligence for the nuclear domain. And in part because, well, I think these things can help us with additional verification. I think they may also help countries do better at target identification and incentivize first strikes, which by their nature may incentivize use it or lose it scenarios. But I think other people are more qualified who have done research to talk on those things than me. One thing I am interested in thinking about, and I think that matters a lot, is what will the future of civilian nuclear energy look like, particularly as many countries around the world are thinking about increasing civilian nuclear energy to deal with how to lower global temperatures or stabilize global temperatures and deal with climate change. There's quite a profound level of interest in civilian nuclear energy, both for climate change reasons, energy independence, and development reasons. And I think one thing we see a lot more countries being interested in that. And so I think we're going to need to do more as far as International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, as far as potentially keeping an eye on things and preventing proliferation. Particularly, I'm in support of the universalization of the additional protocol. But what I'm also interested in is how will Russia's behavior in Ukraine surrounding Zaporizhia affect this future of civilian nuclear energy? We know from the past that the crises in Chernobyl and Fukushima turned public opinion in many countries against civilian nuclear energy. Now, with those reactors in cold shutdown, I think the risk of an accident that goes beyond the parking lot of the nuclear power station is very low. But I think the dynamics that we've seen, the use by Russia of coercive force, risk, and threats at those civilian nuclear power plants, all the articles we've seen about potential accidents at Zaporizhia, I think that has to get ingrained in the public opinion somehow. And I wonder, will that intersect in the long run with the future for nuclear energy? So my question is what future for nuclear energy? And how do we relate that to proliferation, other things, accidents, public opinion? All of which is concerning and interesting. One of the benefits, of course, as I said, that we all get to be hopefully on the same team on some level, is as an academic who has a lot of free time, I get to study these things because I get to work on what I want. And I think there's, one thing that Mr. Putin has done is he's made it so that people like me who, 10, 15 years ago, when this stuff was going out of style, were saying, there won't be that many jobs. I think there's going to be a lot of jobs in the future. And I think there need to be jobs because of this confluence of existential threats. And I as well hope that when jobs continue to open in the future, that the nuclear community continues to do what it's been doing and taking on a more diverse workforce as far as gender, as far as national origin, as far as race, as far as ideas. And I think that that's something that we really, really need to work on.